are in a position to respond with encouragement. Okay, the third calling is to the profession itself. I believe all Christians are called to redeem the professions in which they work. That is, where the enemy has had the opportunity of distorting God's creation, whether it's entertainment or journalism, tabloid sensationalism, and so forth, our calling is to redeem these professions, is to say, no, we're not about sensation, we're not about scandal, we're not about revealing the lurid details of people's personal lives. It's a free country, you can do that if you want. We are about telling the truth. We are about telling the world the truth. I think most of you will agree that journalism in the current era has a rather bad reputation. Most people think of journalists rather negatively. They think of us as scandal mongers, as people who are sensationalists, and much of journalism, unfortunately, chases scandal and chases sensation. But I believe the call we have to redeem the profession is to return the profession to the honorable level that it had when it started, with those handful of Puritan journalists back in the 1620s and 1630s in England. That is a profession where the whole of society was thirsty for truth, and only a handful of people were willing to speak the truth and to do reporting. Now, I add that I think as Christian journalists, we have a responsibility to go the extra mile in our professional functions. For example, most journalists are a little bit lazy, and I include myself in this. We tend to accept a quote or an explanation from somebody without checking the source. In the old-fashioned journalism schools in the United States, journalism teachers, professors used to say, if your mother tells you she loves you, get a second source for it. Never take anything on faith. Always double check every piece of information that you're given. When I joined Time magazine years ago as a reporter, and then for a period of time I worked as a writer, they had a category of employee called researchers. And the researcher's job was to assemble as much background material from the files and the archives as he or she could to give you background material before you started writing the story. And then, as a writer in the old days of Time, you would get your file, that is, your report from the reporter, be it that person was in Washington or London or whatever it is, and with that person's report and the background that you had absorbed from the researcher, you would craft, hopefully, a sort of fluent story of what happened, let's say, in the British elections that week. But then the researcher's job was to take the text that you had written and that the senior editor had edited, and to put a pencil mark over every single word in the story. That is, the researcher was saying, I have checked every single detail in this story, and I can document it. For example, Charlie Smith was born in Scotland in 1944 or whatever it is. Well, the researcher goes back to Charlie Smith's biography and she gets a double source for whether he was born in Scotland, whether that was the year. That's a fairly simple example. But the researcher's job was to make sure that every single word in the story could be justified either by the reporting of the reporter or by background material. We used to get, when I was working for Time, inquiries late in the week, usually late on Friday night, because the Time magazine in those days would close early on Saturday morning. That is, by closing, that is, all the print would be sealed and sent to the printer. And what often happened was, because we were a weekly news magazine, my reporting on Wednesday or Thursday would be more up to date than what the editor had read in the New York Times on Monday or Tuesday. So I would get these checkpoints from the researchers. New York Times says Palestinian leader was wearing a green suit. Your file says he was wearing a brown suit. Can you please respond? And I would say, well, actually he was wearing a brown suit because I was at the press conference when he showed up. That doesn't mean to say the New York Times reporter was a bad reporter. It just means that in the course of the week he had a much more demanding schedule than I did as a weekly magazine reporter, and wasn't able to check out the details as efficiently as we could with the weekly. So I think we have to go the extra mile, and in today's world that doesn't just mean double checking quotes for accuracy or double checking the accuracy of a person's suit, which is a rather trivial detail, but I think it means asking additional questions that had not been asked by our editors and perhaps were not asked by us. One of the wonderful experiences of Time was we had a few managing editors who were really exceptional intellects, were very intelligent people. And one of the most marvelous managing editors I ever worked for was a man called Henry Grunewald, who was a real intellectual. He'd written books. He was the managing editor of Time. He was a refugee from Vienna. He was Jewish, brilliant education. And he would send these infuriating checkpoints late in the week. Need to know in the story what the attitude was of a professor of history at something or other college who had written about this subject. Well, he had read a book by this professor of history. I didn't even know about it. So, at 9 o'clock at night, I had to call somebody up and say, excuse me, are you Professor so-and-so? Did you write a book? Did you say this, that, and the other? And it was infuriating, but it was absolutely important because it improved the story. Just asked the additional question that ordinary reporters weren't smart enough or educated enough to ask. So I think we have a job to be better informed than our colleagues in other publications, to be more investigative, more diligent. I think our responsibility is also to be more skeptical. And this leads to my final point that I sometimes make to Christians. Christians often ask me, well, what about when you're reporting other Christians? And I have an anecdote that I want to tell you about. I had spoken at, I better not say where it was, but at a Christian university that had a course in journalism many years ago. And one of my former students there, I'd only given a lecture, I wasn't a professor or anything, had liked what I had said, and he had gotten a job after graduating with a local newspaper. And the newspaper was diligently reporting on a certain high-profile ministry in that area. That is, the founder of this particular university apparently had family members who were involved in all kinds of rather strange business dealings. And so he had started a series for the newspaper investigating this important Christian person, and he'd been criticized at church. People had come up to him and said, "How dare you criticize God's anointed one?" And his reply was, "Well, I'm just doing my job." And so he called me up and he said, "David, what should I do?" And I said, "You should tell the truth. It's our job to tell the truth even about brothers and sisters in Christ if they are not behaving as they should, or they are bringing into disrepute the name of Christ himself. And we have to do that and let the chips fall wherever they may." And he said, "Thanks, I'll do that." He went back to his job. He got an award for the investigative series he was doing, and then he got a promotion and was offered an even better job at another place elsewhere. And he was offered a job as a journalist to report. I took him around, I took him to China to report on the church in China in 1998. And his editors knew he was a Christian, but they trusted him to write a report truthfully about Christianity in China because he had demonstrated integrity as a reporter dealing with a fellow Christian in a very controversial area. So the bottom line is, be a good reporter. Do your job in a really responsible way, and everybody will respect you. I absolutely guarantee that. And even people who are not Christians or are suspicious of Christianity will respect you. And that will be your open door one day along the road to have a private conversation with somebody who said, "You know, I have this problem, blah, blah, blah." And he or she starts pouring out a story to which you can offer the grace of the gospel. So that's all I have to say. If you have any questions, I'm happy to.